my father was born in Marshallton. Um, his father's father is the first Cann in Marshallton was the Reverend William Cann. And that was back in the late 1800s. So that was one of his last parishes, and that's why there are Canns who were kind of left behind. He did move on to another parish after that.
And this is the Methodist?
Methodist, United Methodist Church, yes. And it was common then for the ministers to stay for a few years and then move on to another parish. They were all pretty much country, whether it's Romansville, Mortonville, or Marshallton, or further away. But yeah, that's where my father was actually born. Was in Marshallton. My mother was from Westchester, and it was interesting because back then, I'm not even sure there was a Downingtown High School. There probably was, but my father went to Westchester, and that's how he met Mom in Westchester. So,
What
far
house did they grow up in Marshallton?
as the one right across from the Grange, the old farmhouse
Is that the Ernie
next to the general
Heimberger
store.
house right now?
Pardon?
Is that Ernie Heimberger's house?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. Ernie has lived there for quite a few years. Yes, yeah. My grandparents lived there until they passed away in the early '80s, and it was, I guess, around 1980. Now that I think about it, because yeah. So, but that's how, and then
And you
a lot.
grew up in that house?
I grew up. No. My parents married in '38. They built a brick house on the east end of Marshall, at the corner of Lucky Hill Road and Strasburg Road, and that's where I grew up.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I have one brother, my baby brother. He's a lot younger. They didn't think they were going to have any more kids, and or were able to, and then all of a sudden, Ted showed up, and he's my baby brother. He lives up in North Jersey. He's married and moved away a long time ago. He's a lawyer, and he got into banking, and he just recently retired. So it's just the two of us.
And I believe your father built that brick house?
Yes.
What year?
Actually, my father had a lot of uncles, and there'd be my great uncles. Most of them I knew pretty well. A couple of them were gone before I was around or before I was old enough to know them. But my Uncle Gus, it was John Cann, was a builder, and he actually built the house for them. So that was kind of neat. And he was a great guy. Matter of fact, I think there's someone that I haven't met yet in Marshallton who is related by marriage to Uncle Gus. You told me about it.
Yeah.
I'd like
I
to.
can't recall.
Yeah. So, but
Yeah,
that's
they're all
that's
coming
another
out of the
generation. Yeah, that's. But there were, yeah, the Reverend Cann, William Cann, had 7 kids, 6 boys and a girl, and
So you grew up on the hill, I guess.
yep.
How was your life growing up in Marshallton compared to who were your friends in Marshallton? What were some early memories that you remember? What's your first memory of Marshallton?
Oh gosh. If you're talking about memories of the village itself, my memories go back to everything from fox hunts to, and this is not keeping necessarily in order of things, but as a little boy, I remember the air raid sirens going off all around the countryside, and everybody had to pull their shades down. Now, this is during the war, and in later years, I got to thinking, what the heck were we afraid of? There's no way the Nazis were going to get here, and they certainly weren't going to be coming by air. So, at any rate, that was the protocol then, and it was scary. You know, you're a little kid, and your father's running around pulling the shades all down in the nighttime, and the sirens going off in the distance all the way from Westchester. We could hear the sirens from the big smokestack whistles at the power plant, and
All over the countryside.
Yep. And
Heard that one.
you remember those things because they're scary.
What if
And
you were outside playing and a siren went off? What would you
I don't
do?
recall them going off during the day, tell you the truth. I can't answer that. There was no protocol like there would be today with the power plants and that type of thing. What you do, is get out. We weren't going anywhere. But generally, I mean, Marshallton was a fun place to grow up. It was friendly. Everybody knew everybody because there weren't that many people there. Most of the families had been there for a long time. Had maybe lived on farms outside and then come in to live in Marshallton as they retired. And other people came from other areas too. But I would say it was a pretty close-knit village. One of my early memories, of course, it's tied into this time of the year, which was Halloween, where it was really fun because we really had to get dressed up because we would go around to literally every house, and all the people in those houses knew all the kids in the neighborhood, and they had to guess who you were. It was a big deal, and you had to really try to hide yourself, because I had blonde hair when I had hair, and the women would be looking. I think I see some blonde hair. I think that's little Harry, But they had to guess everybody. Some they would just give up, and some costumes were better than others. But it was a big deal, and we would stand there like this in the kitchens with every family right up and down the street.
And did people decorate their houses with pumpkins and really get into it?
Not like today. No, that wasn't. I mean, it's a huge thing today. But yeah, there were decorations. But again, different.
Do you remember the people that gave you the good candy and the bad candy?
Can't say that I do, but when you're small, as you know, when you go home and you empty out all your goodies, it's magic. And but it was really, really fun. But I kind of remember that because things were so friendly and low key. You didn't have to worry about all the things we worry about today, where parents are afraid to let their children, go to some of the houses or whatever, or walk around. They were right there with them. Whereas we used to walk around by ourselves. Thinking about the children that I grew up with, I think the early most common denominator was the church, Sunday school. We all went to Sunday school together at the Methodist Church. Things like Cub Scouts and brownies were other things so that's how I primarily got to know a lot of the kids as small kids. Because as time went on, I actually, my time in Marshallton was spent only pretty much in the summers because I was going to school in Westchester. I went to Friends School in Westchester, demonstration school, because my mother was had been a teacher, so I was able to get into the school at the State Teachers College. That is how I met a lot of people from Westchester who became my friends also, and I attended the YMCA there. But in Marshallton, I think probably the church was probably the first place where I got to know all the kids in Marshallton, and they became my playmates throughout, all the way up to when we were driving cars. So it was fun for me because I had like two sets of friends, my Westchester friends, my Marshallton friends, and there was no connection between them at all.
Was there adult supervision when you played? Did you have much interaction with the adults? Did they watch over you as kids? Did you feel safe?
I'd say there was, when you're talking about supervision of childhood kids playing, I would say very little, other than you be home before dark, or I want you back in an hour, but no, that was, again, a different era. No one had any fear for their kids. I used to make a joke that you could literally, because we all had bicycles, you could probably take a half-hour nap on the White Line on Route 162. Again, there were no cars, hardly any cars at all. And so we used to go up and play on the playground all the time with bicycles. And of course, as we got older, playgrounds in Marshallton School, right, the elementary school, right next to it and behind it. Yeah. So, and as we got older, we played football there and sports. We were all into sports. That's another thing. All my buddies played sports, even from ground up. I mean, we're all baseball fans because baseball was it back in those days, and we're talking in the 40s now, and into the 50s. It was.
Where'd you play baseball? Was there a designated field in Marshall?
Well, it depends what time you're talking about. Yeah, when we were small, we play any place we had a ball and a bat. I mean, literally from the playground next to the school to somebody's, field, which was challenging. On one of the farms close by, wherever we could find it. We played on a little bit, as I recollect now, on the what's the Embry farm right in the middle of Marshall and across from the church. It's now got 50-foot trees on it. It was a pasture then. So we played there. Anywhere you get a ball and a bat. As we got older and started to play and more organized, we played out at Embryville at the state hospital. There was a regular field out there and regular organized teams. My father played on the Marshall Lions, and then me later. So that was really fun, and we used to. I could talk for hours about baseball, but.
So as a young kid in the summertime, you spent a lot of time playing baseball. Did you go down to the Brandywine?
Yeah, we did. We did everything. Yep, we went to the Brandywine. We went fishing. Got a little bit older. We'd go down to Lenape Park. That was a major focal point for all kids. They had the big pool down there, and we would go down, swim at the pool down at Lenape. Yeah, and there was really no cliques, if you will. We were all friends, boys and girls.
Different ages?
Yeah, we were not that much difference in age. There were an older group, I would say, of mainly guys who were a little older than I was. So they were driving when we weren't, but they were 4 or 5 years older. They kind of hung together. And then there was our group, which was several years younger. There were a lot of us within 2 or 3 years of age, and it was cool. One of the guys that jumps to my mind was Dave Cox, who was the father of Dave Cox, who has the Marshallton Inn now. So it's really, really neat to see that generation coming back.
So he was a resident of Marshallton, or?
Mm-hmm. Then he moved to Westchester, which was really funny because he became a friend of my wife's because they went to school together in the same class, and their names were last names were the same, so they usually sat next to or behind each other. So
Really?
She got to know Dave real well. Yeah.
I think the fire company hosted a fair. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And that was
West Bradford Fire Company Fair. Yes.
so
that was fun. Oh yeah, we all did, and not just that fair. I mean, again, that was not when we were real young. It wasn't a fire company. Mm-hmm. Fire company we were not. The era I'm talking about, starting out young, there was no fire company. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, but all of the rural villages had fire companies. And as we got older, we used to go to their fairs too, whether it's West Goshen or you name it, all up Glenmore and Medina. It was fun. Fire company fairs were a big deal. And they still are.
Was there any hangout in Marshallton that you and your group used to go to?
Where did we hang out in Marshallton? Again, which year are you talking about? When we were young, of course, the general store right in the middle of town across from the inn was a big time. And at the time we were growing up, Mike Chambers had it. And
is that the brick building?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was turned into apartments later, and actually the fire company was right next to it, but it wasn't there then. Mm-hmm. And that was big time because it was important for lots of reasons. That's where we went to get all our goodies, ice cream and candy and sodas. And it could hang because a lot of the older guys would hang there too, and we'd be the young guys listening to them talk. But yeah, that was, again, that was there for quite a few years. And he either died or moved away, and another fellow took it over, and then another fellow, and it wasn't the same. But the big thing was that my friend Susie McHugh, Susie Hall, her mother and father started a general store right across the street from there in the front of what's now the Four Dogs. So that became a focal point. Same story. It's where we all went to get our goodies, and it was fun. It was really fun. It's like people can't imagine, but we used to go up and down the roads and pick up bottles. I'm sorry to say there was people were trashing the countryside even back then, but they were all glass bottles, mainly Coke, some Pepsis, and we would go collect them, and we'd come in with our hands like 10 bottles, our pockets all filled, and we go to Mike's General Store and we get 2 cents a piece for the bottles.
Not bad.
So
Back then, huh?
if you had 25 or 30 cents, you could hitch a ride, because that's the way we got to Westchester. When we say going to town, it meant Westchester, not Philadelphia. And we could go to Westchester and with that 30 cents or so, go to a movie, get an ice cream cone, maybe a comic book, go to Woolworths 5 and 10, make a day of it on 30 cents. Probably still have 3 cents left when we got back. 'Cause penny candy was big, so you didn't waste a penny. But those bottles were a big source of income, and it was fun.
So you mentioned the Four Dog. What do you remember of the Marshallton Inn and the Four Dog? The Four Dog
Well,
was
the Four Dogs was way, way off in the future. Okay, the hotel, Marshallton Hotel, which was run by Hen Jefferson at that time for many, many years. He also owned the building across the street, which was now the Four Dogs, but there were several things in there. Again, back when I was very young, and I didn't really realize it then, the front place was a bookie joint. And always had the shades were drawn, and people would stop, and men would be going in and out of there, and so on and so forth. Behind that was Ralph Wallace's garage, and he worked on cars, and I think lived upstairs. And but the middle bay there was a focal point for me, because I don't remember many other little kids in there, but my grandfather, my great uncle, his partner, and all the other men from the community would shoot shuffleboard there at night. And it was great camaraderie. People from all walks of life, were there. The air was blue with cigarette and cigar smoke. And they played shuffleboard. I don't remember any drinking there, even though the hotel was right across the street. Mm-hmm. I guess some of them...
That was the Marshallton Inn then?
Marshallton Hotel then, yeah.
Okay.
Right. And that was a real focal point. And it really just showed the way all the people then were friends. There was no... It didn't make any difference whether somebody came right out of the fields and had been farming all day, or like my grandfather came out of Westchester from a business, or whatever. They were all got together and they were buddies, and
all walks of life.
all walks of life. But
did men and women
no,
intermingle?
I can't say there were any women in the Spit and Chew.
Okay.
No, nor would they have wanted to be.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't. There was nothing. I never heard profanity. I never heard anything. These were all, just clean living people for the most part that smoked too much.
And who owned the Spit and Chew?
Well, I think Hen Jeffers owned all of it,
Okay. The inn and
all the real estate, yeah. But he donated that as, for his, civic center. Yeah, but I would sit there with my grandfather, and, I just waited until they would let me shoot a game with somebody, and I was only about that tall. I could hardly see over the shuffleboard.
And you were all pretty competitive? It was
Were they competitive? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely competitive, yep.
was there money put down on it?
Was there money put down on the shuffleboard? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't swear to that, but I don't recall seeing tables full of money like a poker game. Mm-hmm. If there were any poker games going on, they would have probably been in the bookie joint in the front. But I don't know. I don't know. My family, quite truthfully, never gambled that I know of, any of them.
So when you were young, were there any buildings that you remember that aren't there today? I understand there was a barn behind the Four Dog.
You were talking about the structures in Marshallton and the buildings, how much has changed. It's funny because to me the village is almost unchanged, basically. It went for decades, centuries almost, and then they finally built a couple developments in the 50s on either end of Marshallton. But that's pretty much been it. Since then, there hasn't been any more. In town, most of the places are still there. They might not have the same look. They've been done over. But the barns that burned down, there was an era, and I can't remember the dates now, but I was living in Marshallton then. I was actually, after I was married, where barns were being burned all over the countryside. There was an arsonist or two running around, and we would just wait for the sirens and then, shudder because you could see a glow in the sky. It might be 5 miles away, but they burned down the Johnny Baldwin barn, which is right behind the inn. My barn I had when I lived next to the church, in the little house, stone house next to the church, had a barn. That burned, not while I was there. Of course, later on, the barn that was next to my parents' place on the edge of Marshall, and that burned just a few years ago. That wasn't arson, that was an accident.
Do you remember Campbell Weir?
Of course I remember Campbell Weir. When I was looking at your outline here, Campbell Weir was certainly a, where would he come under, what, prominent people, I guess, old tales.
Prominent people. Yeah.
Campbell was certainly prominent. He was, I guess he was an ex-military guy, but he owned the Humphrey Marshall House. And a lot of my buddies, as they got older, worked for him because he wasn't a farmer, but he had, his farming operations going on, and they did jobs for him and so on the farm. But I didn't have any real interaction with Campbell, but we all knew Campbell Weir, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. And he was a rich guy from outside, I guess.
How about the blacksmith shop? What role did that play in you growing up? Was it a hangout?
Blacksmith shop that you're speaking of course, was a focal point always, but not a hangout. No, it was just a known spot because it was an operating blacksmith shop. And when we were young, we didn't think of it as being someday more of a historic treasure. It was a place where a man made a living shoeing horses, and as kids, he would let us come in there when we were little, and we'd sit there, fascination. Bill Ludwig was the main blacksmith at that point. I remember there was one before him, I barely remember. And Bill would just watching him on that anvil was like music. You watch a blacksmith that really is skilled work. It's really choreography, and keeping the coals hot, moving the shoes in and out, and all at the same time trying to keep a huge horse happy when you're holding its foreleg and trying to put a shoe on it or take a shoe off and work on those hooves and everything. And they would, that's not a job for the faint of heart. And it was fascinating to us kids. And he would give us the old shoes, to take home with us. And I don't think there's anyone growing up in Marshallton in that era that wouldn't say that how important the blacksmith shop was, but not a hangout. Mm-hmm. There was nothing.
Point of interest to go and
maybe
keep warm in the wintertime.
Yeah. No, the only time anybody went near it was when Bill was working on horses.
Mm-hmm. And that's what he did predominantly at that time period.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So Harry, as you grew up through Marshallton in your teenage years, what kind of work did you do? Did you work around Marshallton in the summertime? Have some summer jobs?
It's funny. What work did I do? It seems like I've never done anything but work. I'm still working 75, 80-hour weeks in Philadelphia. So Don't ask me how or why, but it seems like the right thing to do. But yeah, well, since my grandfather had a large farm, which was tied in with his business, Esco Farms, I worked there in the summer as soon as I was old enough. Actually, yeah, I started out mowing lawns, with his, with the man that I really learned how to work from. He was a retired, semi-retired farmer. And after I worked a few summers with that man, I never complained about hard work in my life. He was in his 70s, out there hoeing all day long in 90-degree heat.
And who is this?
Frank Riggins. Riggins, he had a son.
Any relation to Earl Riggins?
Yes.
Okay.
Close relation, yes. Frank was unbelievable, and he taught me so much. I'm talking from 12, 13 years old, all the way up, and then I started working on the farm when I could run machinery and everything and tractors. So I worked with Frank Reimel and Bud Reimel because they were the farm managers then, and it was a great part of my upbringing. I love farm work. I'm actually an agricultural engineer, that's another story. But yes, I worked on the farm. That was it.
And then in your later years, Harry, I know you're known for doing some restoration work around town. I know you worked on a couple of buildings. You want to comment on that at all, and what time period in your life that
Well,
was?
you're asking about my time in construction was rather limited, and that was way down the road. I was late 30s and my 40s, I guess. So that was, and I wasn't really working around Marshallton at the time. I was mostly working up in northern Chester County, building replica farmhouses, which was fun. But it gets to a point where, I physically enjoyed the work, but I got to the point where it was probably getting a little too tough. Everybody has their interesting stories. We had, everybody from, like I mentioned, the store owners to Harry Perdue, which was, everybody knew Harry Perdue. He was a
prominent person.
prominent part. Yeah, everybody knew Harry. He was a World War II vet and very active in Veterans Affairs. Everybody knew Harry. And he's got the same name I do.
And he lived in the farm across from the church, right? The Embry.
Embry Estate. Yeah, I'll call it that. Yeah. Yeah, he did. And Harry was fun to know. He was a good guy. And but you talk about that, just if you look at the Albertsons that had the farm right outside of Marshallton, okay, Dick and Millie, right? They were flying farmers.
What's a flying farmer?
At a plane. They flew. And how many, this was early on, matter of fact, we used to see Dick would be flying over Marshallton, flying low, and there goes Dick Albertson again. And I believe Millie was a pilot also. As a matter of fact, I think maybe when she passed, she was written up as being a pioneer in that for women. And of course, their daughter Edie is still there on the farm as far as I know. I haven't seen her in years, and her brother passed away.
Right.
But they were part of the Marshallton community too. It's just you don't realize how many interesting people there are. I grew up with all the Busby children, and their family's been around forever. And the Trimbles, they were related. Yerkes lived down on Clayton Road or whatever. Yeah, they were not really into the community that much. But people you didn't realize, sometimes I didn't realize till I got older, like right across the street when I lived next to the church, the Matsons lived there. And he was a house painter, very quiet, delightful man, and she also. And I didn't realize till I lived there. One night I was living across the street and I heard this music. And I thought, what the heck is that? I went outside and it was coming from their house. And I didn't realize they were classical musicians. And they had a group that came from wherever, concert level people. And they would sit over there in their house, which I didn't know until I was actually living up in Marshallton, that they had that, talent level and skill. And it was really neat. to hear them, and I talked to Joe about it later. I just didn't know, but things you don't know about people.
And which house was this here?
Right next to what was the parsonage, right across from the church.
Okay.
Right across from the church, and just everyone has stories. You talk about places where people congregated and everything. Like my friend Barbara Durnall, her dad, Zip, was a very, very lovely man, prominent in the community. He had a business, and we all used to hang out on their porch, right in the middle of town, across from the inn. My great-grandmother lived in the little house right next to the inn. I had a great uncle who lived, George McAllister, lived right next to the blacksmith shop. There was a lot of related, but these weren't Canns. These were Canns by by marriage or by relationship. So there was quite a few of the family, if you will, around, scattered all around town. But that's just one name and one family of a lot of very, very nice and talented people.
So what were family gatherings like?
Family gatherings, for me, it was all pretty much centered around, the holidays, over the river and through the woods, to grandmother's house. We all did, because a pretty big family with my uncles and all my cousins. And of course, my grandfather had the big farm, and down on the furthest farm where one of my uncles lived, they had a swimming pool. So we would congregate down there for all the family picnics, and that was unbelievable. Watermelons in the spring house, and
Off Lucky Hill Road?
yeah. And that was very memorable, because that's where I learned to swim. My grandfather built that pool in the early 40s, and started it out as literally a community pool. He was letting people from the community come down and use it and swim, and had to hire a lifeguard to be there. It was Winnie Johnson, who was Earl Johnson's wife, from right in the middle of town. And they did that for quite a few years, and then, like a lot of things, it gets abused, and the older kids were carrying on at night and so on. They had to fence it and close it. But same thing happened with the farm pond he built, which is right on Lucky Hill Road. He actually put that farm pond in for the fire company. So when they formed the fire company, because they had no way to get water, and they would send the pumper down there and take water out of the pond until they drilled a deep well up at the fire company, right next to, across from the inn.
That's
So
like
that
a
was
small pond between here and Lucky Hill Road.
Yeah. Yep. Bob Portnoy looks right at it.
Yeah.
But that was, he put that in, had a dock. Guys would go down there and swim. We'd ice skate all winter. Had a boat that somehow got destroyed. So that kind of went its way too, and just became a farm pond. But all those were focal points. And ice skating, especially in the winter, was everybody in town would go down and ice skate on the pond. So that's just the way it was. It was a great place to grow up. And just as a sidebar on that, unfortunately, there aren't many of us left that I grew up with. Very, very few. I can count them on one hand, and there were dozens. But a couple of us still get together a couple of times a year and reminisce and have a dinner together up at the inn. Fortunately for me, they're all women. And so it's really nice, because we have that common bond and thread that we can go all the way back from little kids to doing crazy stuff. Like I remember throwing all of them in my car once and taking them all the way over to Richmond's in New Jersey to get ice cream. That's all the way over across the ferry, which is now the Delaware Memorial Bridge.
Well, even more fortunate is the fact that your wife doesn't object to you getting together with 4 other women. Maybe
Fortunately,
not.
I don't go there.
All right.
She does know them all. That's a good thing. But it's testimony to the way your old friends can be your best friends, and you have no qualms about talking about anything, because you all remember when.
Yeah.
And but I remember of course, I again spent a lot of time in Westchester, so I had that experience too. But when we all got a little bit older and started to drive, that was really an adventure. And those are things, a lot of stories there I won't tell because my mother, God bless her, who's still living at 104, if she heard some of those stories, she'd probably still whoop me. Because I can't believe you did that, Harry. Yeah, we weren't always too safe about what we did back then. You know, a little drag racing and stuff like that, maybe. But again, one other thing. It was interesting because there were no cars. I said sleeping on the white line.
Yeah.
Very few people had cars at all. My father had a car, and of course, he worked in Westchester. But when my mother and I had to go to Westchester, we took a bus, as did everybody else. And when I got a little older, I was allowed to thumb it in, which was a common transportation mode. But again, you really weren't worried because if there was no, you either knew the person that was picking you up,
Sure.
or you didn't have to worry about them. And we were allowed to do that kind of stuff with no supervision. But it wasn't until later that there became more cars, and I'm talking well into the 50s.
Is there any memories of Embryville, the mental hospital that you were
Well,
in, or-
Emeryville, yeah, of course I remember, but mainly from baseball. And some of the other stories, maybe I could touch on them without any. It was a mental hospital, of course, and a lot of the residents there were vets, and coming back with all kinds. Well, now they have names for everything: post-traumatic stress disorder, all that. But these guys were damaged, not necessarily physically, but there were some real problems, and some of them had to be under lockdown, some not, and they would leave and come marching through town, and that. But nothing ever bad ever happened from that. But we still had to be a little bit careful when we were playing ball out there because a lot of those guys would come down to watch us and everything, and there wasn't much supervision, quite truthfully. But yeah, the Embryville State Hospital, as you would call it, was a big deal then. There was no state police barracks out there then. It was out there all by itself.
middle of nowhere?
But yeah, in the middle of nowhere. But it was great for us to go out and play ball in that big park. But I'm glad something's finally happening with it because it certainly has been a problem area since it was closed.
Harry, were there any notable events, for instance, Hurricane Hazel? I keep hearing there was a blizzard of 1958.
Notable events in Marshallton, yeah, or anywhere else for that matter, yeah. Of course, I mentioned the experiences of World War II and
Right.
Korea, and nobody seems to talk about Vietnam. But I had an interesting conversation with a truck driver about that the other day because he asked me, because I was an older fellow, he said, Harry, if I was just to ask you things in your lifetime that you would consider some of the most momentous things that changed your life or our life, it took me about 2 seconds to say Nam. Okay? And I can give you all kinds of reasons why, but that was the first thing I could come up with. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And I explained to him why. And he was very interested. And we didn't go, but at any rate, I remember Korea very well. Again, I was in an age bracket where I didn't really hit any war.
Right.
But Korea, we all were focused on as that age of young adults or teenagers or whatever. And it was every day, we were on the news and we wanted to see, we were all G.I. Joes, we were all dap, 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 dap. Just like 10 years earlier, we were all cowboys. We were all Roy Rogers, as we used to play that all over the village. But then, yeah, we were all very focused on Korea, and then Nam, of course. That I was trying to raise a family then, but
Right.
it made a big impact for lots of reasons. But as far as natural events, that type of thing, yeah, Hurricane Hazel, that was scary. I don't want to go through another hurricane. That's the only one I can say I really went through, where we were really huddled in the basement all night, and we knew it was trouble when we looked, and we had a big stockade fence, and it was still daylight, and that thing took off and flew up into the pine trees, poles and all. And I think my dad said, I think we're going to the basement. And we sat down there all night while the winds howled and hoping the roof didn't come off. But my Uncle John built the house pretty well. It stayed in one piece. Blizzard of '58, yeah, I remember that one too. No power for days. I remember we were cooking on the fireplace. I was away in school at that time. My father was able to get me out of there before the blizzard, and some of my classmates didn't get out because it was a boarding school. But yeah, that was fun. We've had other blizzards too that were almost as bad, but that was a bad one. The one thing that I should mention was a big part of life was the fox hunting.
Were you a rider?
Yes and no. Most of my family was, not me so much, but we were very much aligned with that because the same farm where the swimming pool was where they hosted the Brandywine Hills point-to-point races for years and years. And
before BVA.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was really neat. I actually have videos of those races, which I had made into CDs. My grandfather had pictures, 16 millimeters he took of all those. And I had them all put together years ago and made into CDs, which I don't know if I can play a CD anymore, but gave them to all the family members because they would all remember it. Again, we're back in the 40s, late 40s. It was awesome. But the fox hunting, there were like 4 hunts, I believe, that hunted around Marshallton. You had Brandywine, you had Westchester Hunt, you had Hen Jeffers had his own hunt out in Romansville. What was the fourth one? I'm trying to think, but they were always coming and going. I mean, and it was really beautiful. You see those hounds in full cry chasing.
Was this a different time, or do they get together and have joint hunts, or are these?
I don't think so. Hunts? I don't think they were separate hunts. Mm-hmm. Separate hunts. There may be some riders were more than one hunt. Could well be. Again, I wasn't really part of that.
Right.
And my cousin who was in New England, Chuck, he's a little younger than I am. He would remember because his dad was right in the middle of it. He was my uncle. But yeah, that was really, really fun. That whole, just to see all those hunts coming through. It's amazing that I lived through it because I should have asked my mom the story, but we lived right on the edge of the farm.
Right.
And there was no fence or anything. The hounds would come right through, and my mom was a little naive. When I was a baby in a basket, she put me out under one of the trees out in the yard, and the hunt was coming through. And I can't remember. I'll have to ask her if she remembers. I'm sure she does. Whereas my father or somebody said, "Where's Harry?" She's always on this. Get him quick! Here, these hounds are coming. Oh, you know what happens when they catch a fox?
Yeah.
Here would be a little tiny baby, 8 months old or something in a bassinet, and they ran down and got me. And I'll have to ask her that story because I realized early on you don't mess around with a pack of foxhounds. Mm-hmm. But those are all, they just were everywhere. Yeah. It was a big part of life around Marshallton with the fox hunts. Mm-hmm. Talking about my grandfather, which I love to do, I was very close to my grandfather, who I'm named for, and was obviously a major influence in my life, as both my grandfathers were. I was very blessed to have wonderful grandparents that I know them all well because I was in my 30s and they were all still living, which is unbelievable. So I got to know them all very well. But I spent more time and worked more with my grandfather, Harry Cann, than anyone actually growing up. He was a fascinating man. The Cann family, I think I mentioned earlier, was in Marshallton. There were a whole bunch of them, He and his brother Merle were the 2 youngest. And they eventually became partners. But the Cann family per se, if I give you a little bit of history there, I can go back a long, long way, but it's interesting to me that the John Cann of Delaware was the first Cann in the United States, and he was actually granted land from William Penn in 1683, 84 was when those deeds were drawn. I actually have a copy of it. Bill Baldwin, who was very active in Marshallton also years ago and had Baldwin's Book Barn. He was very into history, and he gave these things to me too. Now I can look it up all online. You can look it up, John Cann, and I find out things I didn't know. But so the Canns have been here a long time. It was he and William Penn were contemporaries, and obviously they knew each other. And but everybody came into Newcastle then. If you're not familiar with Newcastle, Delaware, you should be. It's a wonderful, wonderful place and an early part of our early history. And it was the 38th year of the King's reign. He was one of the first Cann, and he became pretty prominent down there, evidently. And so if you go down in Delaware, you'll see Cann's names around, and they kind of emigrated this way, north. I know my grandfather, Harry, was actually born and raised down around Nottingham, Fremont, Pennsylvania, right on the border. And with Maryland, and actually the Cann name, not to beat it to death, goes back where John Cann came from was in the general area of Bristol, England, where there were dukes named Cann and everything else, but the first known Cann was actually, the name was Caen, and was goes back to Normandy. The first Cann was actually Caen, was a friend and came over with William the Conqueror in 1066 and settled in southwest England, I guess. And were there and then still there when John emigrated in the 1600s. So you're talking hundreds of years and not dozens. So that's as far back as I can go from the family trees. But all that stuff's kind of fascinating to know those things. And but at any rate, to talk about Pup, I was the oldest of the grandchildren, so I spent more time with him. Lucky me, which really feel fortunate. And when he had started his career actually in Marshallton. Didn't have a lot of high education. He became a stenographer for the railroad, did things like that. After he got married, he had the general store in Marshallton for a while, right next to the house where he lived, across from the Grange. And eventually, he was a very personable guy and gregarious and a great salesman. And he got into sales because he didn't grow up on a farm, but around farm. Definitely, everybody was into agriculture then. And he started, actually, he was selling milking machines for Empire Milking Machine out of Elmira, maybe, northern New York State. And eventually he decided to get into manufacturing. I mean, I don't know all the intricacies, but he and his younger brother Merle joined him, and they formed Eastern Sales Company. And they started out just selling milking machines and other things, but then as milk coolers were more evident, my grandfather actually designed and patented the first electric milk cooler with an old Frigidaire unit on the top of it or something. I still have all those patents and pictures. How he got from being a minister's son with, we'll say, minimal education to being an inventor, designing products like that, and then manufacturing them and selling them all up and down the eastern coast is really testimony to not only to his hard work. He worked very, very hard. And he used to tell me stories about trying to keep a car on the road out in the mud and the dirt, and the tires used to blow out every 3 miles. They'd have to take them off and patch them to keep going because they were all dealing in an agricultural market. That's all he ever wanted to do was sell to farmers because that's where his comfort level was. And he did that for many years. And he eventually, Esco Cabinet in Westchester, they took over the Sharpless plant, which is unfortunately now apartments. When Sharpless went bankrupt, in the early, I guess it was in the 1520, somewhere in there. Grandfather started buying buildings from him, and then eventually bought that whole complex, which was the Sharpless Works, and it was Esco Cabinet. It was like 185,000 square feet. So at one time, and they get into everything. They manufactured water coolers, milk coolers, walk-in rooms, freezers. As the years went by, my grandfather, had a pretty major workforce with engineers and draftsmen and all that helping him. But a lot of the ideas came out of his head, and he'd scratch them down in pretty good detail on a yellow tablet, handwritten. I have tons of them still. And turn them over to the guy, say, "Can you make this for me," or whatever, or "How about we try that?" And he was prolific in that. But his main thing, he was a salesman and very engaging personality, not flamboyant at all, just genuine. He was a country boy, pure and simple. But at one time, I would say probably during or after the war, he probably had 300 people working there in that factory. So Esco was one of the larger employees in the county, actually. There weren't that many around. You had Schramm, you had Wyeth, you had Lasco starting up, and Hoop's Brothers in Darlington Wheelworks was still around, but they were the major employers. There was no Great Valley, there was no King of Price, nothing was there.
And you said they sold all over the world?
Mostly United States, but yeah, they exported some. And my experiences there, start a little later than that. I actually came to work for the company after I was out of college. So at that point, we were more just into milk coolers and milk equipment, the freezer business. Everything got competitive. When they started out, they didn't have much competition. You could put refrigeration on anything. And the big thing that happened, I should mention, which is a little bit of history, is that what fomented a lot of this was the electrification program. You couldn't have had electric milk coolers on farms. There was no electric. They were all Amish, so to speak, at that time. But when electricity started to be distributed around the country, it opened up everything. So electric milk coolers were one of the big first things, and then freezers and walk-ins, because most farmers raised everything. So they needed walk-in rooms and freezers. So they were prime markets for everything that we made.
So
I say we because
the electrical wiring of it.
You had to have wiring first. Yep. And that was all started back in the 20s and in the 30s, 40s. So, but it's some of the things I wanted to just digress a little bit to say that this man amazed me because of what I saw that he had done as I got older. But I look back because I spent so many hours with him when he got into his 50s. I think it was taking a toll on his health, the pressure and the pace that he worked at. And his doctor said, "You need to get some hobbies." And he took up painting just for fun. Didn't take a lesson, bought stuff, taught himself how to paint. And he ended up being a pretty darn good amateur watercolor painter. Still scenes, not people. And a lot of his artwork is still around today and is collected by people that respect it. And he did some very, very nice work. Well, I used to sit with him like down by the Brandywine. He loved the Brandywine. He couldn't paint enough scenes of the Brandywine, the bridges, anything to do with covered bridges he loved. And he would take me with him, and he would sit out there with an easel on a chair in the summer, and I'd be playing around. I was a little boy, and I'd be playing around. I'd come over to watch what he was doing. And that just grew over the years, where when I got a little older, he wanted me with him when he was working on the farm. When he would come home from work, he had an old Beetleback Ford that was full of dirt and hose and tools, never cleaned it out, seeds, sprayers and everything. And he would take me out and we would plant pumpkins. We would plant this all over the place. I used to help him graft trees. He loved fruit trees. And when he would go out on all these farms, he would try to find a farmer that had an apple tree or fruit tree he'd never seen before. He would take cuttings, bring them back, buy rootstock, and graft so that he would have those apples in his orchards. He had more than one on the farm. And so I grew up in that environment too, helping him do all those things and going into the feed stores in Westchester and really got into a farm atmosphere pretty early in my life. And it was because of him. He loved his farm. It was basically a test farm for Esco because we made dairy products, and he had a prize herd of Guernseys. And, I worked there.
When you say the test farm, this was a farm down on Lucky Hill Road?
Well, there are actually 4 farms he bought, actually totaling 500 or 600 acres. But the one where the dairy farm was on Wawasset Road, we call it the Glenworth Farm. That's where he had the herd. And, and prize bulls. He had some bulls. And I learned early on, you don't go near the bulls. And, but that farm was his love. I mean, he just loved his farm and everything about it. And it's interesting because another hobby that he developed around the same time and maybe even earlier, he loved baseball like everybody did. But he took it one step further. He started to take a little time to himself, and he would take a vacation to Sarasota, Florida. And the Red Sox were there. And he became friends with a lot of the Red Sox owners, managers, and players. And that endured all his life. He had that relationship, and it even came over into my generation, my father's generation, where we knew a lot of these ball players. Way after they retired, we kept relationships up with them. That was unbelievable for me as a little boy growing up to be able to be right down there in the locker rooms, because he had all kinds of special privileges. Because a lot of these players were all country boys too, and when they would come to Philadelphia, they would love to come out to the farm, okay? And pitchers, catchers, and first baseman, But he had some that he was really close with. But they would come out to the farm when they were playing the A's in Philly, and my grandmother would put out a country spread, and it was like just utopia to those guys. And
to you too, as a kid growing up, having major league players.
Yeah, and a lot of friends.
Play ball with you? Did you have games with them?
No games. No. Remember, I wasn't very old. Mm-hmm. I mean, and these guys seemed so old to me, but they weren't. They were in their 20s and early 30s, and I would say 90% of them were vets coming back from World War II.
Okay.
Almost all of them. That's throughout the majors, not just the Red Sox. Almost all of them. One of our friends, Joe Dobson, a pitcher, was missing a couple fingers. He was a major league pitcher. And, it was quite a thrill for me. I don't think I realized some of these things until I was later. And that's later on I actually got a chance. And when actually I was a teenager in school, I would help my grandfather go in the factory and help him run tests on milk coolers. His little skinny kid lifting these full cans of water into the milk coolers and dumping them as we test the cooling capacity and the paddles on the milk coolers and everything. I got to the point where I could tell the temperature of water plus or minus a degree with my finger, and I still can. But as I say, the whole farm experience taught me hard work. I mean, you work out in hayfields all day in 90-degree heat with grown men, and you're just a kid, and you had to keep up. The last thing you're going to do is fail. So I cherish those memories, and that's all due to my grandfather.
Sounds like you were his favorite grandson.
I wouldn't say that, because he loved all of us. No, I spent more time with him. And I would think as a man, I got to know him probably better than his sons, because I spent more time with him, because I worked with him. When I joined the company, he and I spent a lot of time together then. And I think I told one of my cousins, I said, I'm the only person who could tell him he's wrong and not get fired. We had a mutual respect, I think. And
so how did he work in Esco all his life? What eventually happened to Esco?
He worked there all his life until he retired. My father had taken over the company then, and I shorted my education. I graduated from Penn State, and I was going to go on to Wharton, University of Pennsylvania, for an MBA, which was kind of the thing to do in that day. And a lot of things happened in the company, which I was kind of heading that way anyway. But, my grandfather was retiring, his brother passed, or was ill, and they were selling the farm, and I just didn't go to school anymore. I came in and joined the company, and so I had a chance to work not only with my father, but my grandfather and my uncles, and because there was a lot of people in the business that were family. That was a good experience for me. I wish I had been a little older. I would have been able to do things a little differently. But we sold the company in late '60s. I stayed on for 4 or 5 years under a management contract, and got into pollution control. I was traveling, flying all over the country then, which not really what a country boy wanted to do. So I got out of that and started doing construction. And then I got back into manufacturing 30-some years ago, and I've been there ever since.
How did your grandfather view Marshallton? He obviously lived in Marshallton. What did he do for Marshallton, in your opinion? Did he hang out with the locals?
My grandfather and Marshallton that's where he lived. And those were his friends were. And his friends were first and foremost to him, after family, of course. He was a very family-oriented man to a fault. And, but yeah, all the people in Marshallton knew him well, and I would like to think respected him. I think if some of the old ones were around, or even in my generation, they would tell you that he was well respected, as was his brother, my Uncle Merle, Dad's Uncle Merle, and they were they were a big part of the community because, they had a major business and a big farm, so it kind of set them apart in that respect, but not in an ostentatious way at all. They were they tried to share everything. I told you about the swimming pool and how that worked out, but the intent was for everybody, whatever they had, they wanted to share. And so Marshallton and their friends were very important. And they were down to earth people. I mean,
and your grandmother too. You haven't said anything about.
Well, my
her.
grandmother,
She was.
of course, she was a dear person. She was a farm girl, McAllister. She grew up in the farm where the point-to-point races were held, where my uncle lived. That was her farm, which eventually my grandfather and uncle acquired from her family. But she grew up there. Her sister lived right across the street from her, next to the Humphrey Marshall house. Rima and Al Bullock. So there's a lot of family around. But she was just a hardworking farm girl, and raised her kids and cooked and everything else. And they, my grandfather loved food.
Who was the gardener in that family?
My grandmother.
Okay.
She had a flower garden out there, and she tended it religiously, She got a little help on the hard work. My grandfather, for all his farm background, was not a working man. I mean, he didn't get dirty too much except planting pumpkins and things. But my grandmother, she grew up on the farm. She knew how to work and was a great cook and baker. Oh, can't tell you some of the meals she would put out. Unbelievable.
Did you have family reunions at your grandparents' house?
We had family reunions. We had all the major holidays. Everybody would congregate. My grandfather would get the projector out and show the films he'd taken in the last year. Christmas holidays were the biggest time, but the other ones too, depending, Yeah, it was the focal point of the whole family, yeah.
Well, Harry, we've covered a lot of territory here. And are there any items that you've forgotten to talk about that you'd like to talk about as a last commentary on your growing up in Marshallton?
Well, I think we've covered a lot, and I probably talked more than I should have or expected to on lots of things. But like anything else, when you finish something like this, you think, oh, I wish I had brought that up. I wish I had brought that up. But my mind is kind of emptying out of the things that I had wanted to talk about. I would just say that it's obviously I've lived most of my life in Marshallton. I don't at the moment, of course, but that's only been 2 or 3 years. otherwise I've been there my whole life, not always in the same house, but so Marshallton's my home, and always will be, and I feel very fortunate.
So one last comment, how do you view Marshallton today, seeing it as the way it is, as opposed to you growing up?
How do I view Marshallton today versus there? Well, first, I don't live there today. I'm not really part of it,
Certainly you
and
go through town.
but it's obviously there are annoying things like the traffic, which we've had to deal with, watch that grow for the last 50 years, and that's probably if I was still there, I probably would have put up a lot of trees myself around the family home because to cut the noise down. But it really, society has changed, but I don't think the village really has. And I think what all of the groups, Bob's work here and your work and all the others, it's great because you're keeping it alive, and some of us just want to help. But I don't see any real nasty changes. I think it's still a charming village. The people change. I wish I knew more of them, but it's just a unique place to me. I've been around a fair amount, and I haven't seen too many places, especially unless the non-resort type places,
Right.
where you have as much charm and folklore and.
But there was a time when certain people wanted to change Marshallton and make it into like a Williamsburg, that at least a couple of times, and as you said, Marshallton stayed about the same.
Yes, it has. I wouldn't have wanted to see it become a tourist attraction, that's for sure. And I don't know that it really ever should have, because what actually happened here that would make it that, I don't know. I mean, you can go to a place like Newcastle I talked about and understand why people flock to go there, and because of the history. Marshallton is just a typical nice, started at agriculture. The Strasburg Road going through was big because that was, as we know, the stagecoaches came through, and that was a main road going west. And I think that set it apart too because of the inns, which have been tried to. What's happened to Marshallton is great. The Marshallton Inn, reviving that, and of course, with your work on the other end, there's not much left of it, but the tavern is there, and the center house is gone. But that was a focal point too. Right there behind there was that building, which was Kaler's drugstore. We all hung out there.
Right.
It was another focal point for young kids because they had a pinball machine. We'd get sodas, and it was a pharmacy Mr. Kaler ran. So there's a lot there, and I could talk for hours probably, but.
Well, you've had a good life in Marshallton. I'd like to thank you for sharing it all with us. And,
Been my pleasure to share what I can. I wish I knew more.